All right, everyone, buckle up because today's deep dive is going to be a real treat. We're taking a trip into the world of the one and only Agatha Christie, but not in the way you might think.
Yeah, no dusty old biographies for us this time.
This time, we're going straight to the source. Agatha's own autobiography. Get ready for the inside scoop on the Queen of Crime.
Exactly. Forget the secondhand accounts and the speculation. We've got Agatha herself as our guide for this one.
We'll be walking in her shoes from her childhood days all the way to the age of 75, uncovering the experiences that shaped the legend we all know and love.
It's really incredible to think about all the stories she must have, right?
Absolutely. I mean, picture it. We're going to wander the halls of her beloved childhood home, Ashfield.
We'll get a taste of her adventures in France.
Meet the fascinating characters in her family.
And of course, we'll be keeping an eye out for those early sparks of her brilliant literary career.
You know, that's our mission today, really, to dig out the most fascinating and revealing nuggets from her memories.
Give you a much richer understanding of her early years, her perspective on her own life.
And who knows, maybe even unearth a few surprises along the way.
Oh, I'm sure there'll be plenty of those. After all, this is Agatha Christie we're talking about.
So let's dive right in, shall we?
Let's do it.
Agatha starts us off in Ashfield, her childhood home. Sounds pretty idyllic from her descriptions, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, she paints a picture of a really lovely, nurturing environment. The house and garden especially seem to hold a special place in our heart.
Right from the beginning, she introduces us to two really important figures, her nanny and her mother.
Oh, the nanny.
I know. She describes her as if she walked right out of a Flemish painting. So calm and patient, can you imagine?
Such a vivid image, isn't it? And that calm demeanor is a pretty stark contrast to Agatha's mother, who had some pretty strong opinions, especially when it came to education.
Oh, yeah. Remember how she believed children shouldn't learn to read until they were 8 years old?
8 years old? I mean, that just seems like torture for a curious little mind.
But Agatha didn't exactly follow that rule, did she?
Not at all.
Yeah.
She was completely enthralled by stories being read aloud. She'd stare at those books, trying to make sense of those letters.
And then all of a sudden, it clicked.
Exactly. Before anyone knew it, she was off reading in secret.
I love that. A little literary rebel in the making. Makes you wonder if that early independent discovery played a part in her lifelong love of stories.
Absolutely. It definitely plants that seed.
Now, beyond her immediate family, Ashfield was filled with another set of characters, the staff. And Agatha makes it a point to say that back then, having household help wasn't necessarily a sign of immense wealth. It was just more common.
It was a different time for sure.
Oh, and her descriptions of the staff are just priceless.
Oh, I know. Tell me you weren't picturing Jane, the cook, while reading that.
Oh, absolutely. A majestic figure, Agatha says, of considerable proportions and with an almost Olympian level of calm.
Can you imagine never getting sick and barely showing any emotion?
She was only ever lightly ruffled, as Agatha puts it, when preparing a fancy dinner.
Huh? It was best to steer clear of the kitchen then.
And then there's Nursey, the nanny. Agatha's descriptions of her are just delightful. I especially love the part about the portrait Mr. Baird painted of her. Sounds like it was a real masterpiece.
It does, and you can tell how much trust Agatha's mother had in her. Nursey was clearly a rock for the entire family.
Oh, and speaking of the family, we can't forget about Tony, Agatha's childhood dog.
Ah, yes, Tony. Or should we say George Washington, as Agatha sometimes called him.
Right, her furry little companion, full of good humor and always patient with her imaginative games.
I love how he even got a promotion to Lord Tony in one of Agatha's secret sagas with her canary, Dickie.
It's so charming, right? And it's remarkable how, even at a young age, she was already giving her animal friends distinct personalities and roles to play.
It really does foreshadow her incredible skill in crafting such memorable characters in her novels.
Now, Agatha also talks about her early encounters with fear. And one story that stands out is the one about the gardener who frightened her when she was around 5 years old.
Oh, yes, that one's a bit unsettling. Poor little Agatha. Can you imagine her fear?
And her imagination running wild, picturing a boiling cauldron.
It's amazing how vivid her imagination was even then.
Thankfully, Nursey stepped in and explained that the gardener was just playing a joke.
It's so interesting, though, because despite that early scare, Agatha says she was always fascinated by fear.
She loved scary stories.
She even enjoyed being frightened, to a certain degree, of course.
It's a bit of a paradox, isn't it?
It is. This kind of push and pull with fear, wanting it but also being scared of it. It's pretty telling. considering she
Yeah.
went on to write some of the most suspenseful novels ever.
It really does make you think. And maybe that early fascination with fear played a part in leading her down the path of crime fiction.
It's definitely a possibility. And this back and forth with fear also shows up in her games with her older sister, Madge.
Ah, yes, Madge and the Scary Sister game. Agatha would beg Madge to pretend to be a frightening older sister, but then of course she'd get scared when Madge actually did it.
So typical of siblings, right?
Totally. And years later, Agatha even admitted that just the sound of Madge's elder sister voice could still give her chills.
It's funny how those childhood fears can linger. But it does raise an interesting question, doesn't it?
What's that?
Why are we so drawn to suspense and thrill? Even in fiction, there's something about the unknown and the potentially dangerous that draws us in.
That's a good question. Maybe it's the adrenaline rush or the feeling of relief when we realize we're safe after all.
It could be a mix of things. It's a bit of a mystery in itself.
Speaking of mysteries, let's talk about Agatha's observations of her family and the world around her.
Really?
She gives us some pretty insightful glimpses into Victorian parenting styles, which she says had a more realistic view of children. There wasn't this constant pressure to be the best or to compare yourself to others.
Yeah, and she talks about how each child in the family was kind of labeled the beauty, the intelligent one, and so on.
And get this, she even admits that she had trouble distinguishing between real people and the ones she imagined. Her imaginary friends were just as real to her as anyone else.
Wow. That's quite a statement about the power of her imagination.
And it's so significant, right? I mean, here she is, blurring the lines between reality and fantasy. It's like a future novelist in the making.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And she introduces us to some really memorable characters from her childhood, like Miss Tower, who she thought looked like a wolf and was always trying to devour her with kisses.
It's a pretty alarming image, right? Poor Agatha.
It is. And then there's Lady McGregor, who they secretly called Mrs. Snooks.
Oh, I love that. Just a little glimpse into their private world.
It's so sweet. And then there's her godfather, Lord Lifford, or Captain Hewitt, as she sometimes called him.
Right, his grand entrance into their home, mistaking the maid, and that whole thing with the topographical proof from the bathroom window. Priceless.
I know. These little anecdotes are just so charming. They really bring the past to life. And it makes you think about how many seemingly insignificant encounters she might have tucked away, only to have them resurface later in her stories.
It's like her writer's mind was always working, constantly observing and absorbing details about people and their interactions.
A real sponge for human nature.
Now, after immersing ourselves in Agatha's childhood and family life, the story takes a new turn with the family's move to Pau in France.
A whole new world for her to explore.
Exactly. It was a whirlwind of social events for her parents and her sister Madge. And for Agatha, well, she got a new nurse, Mademoiselle Markham.
I'm curious, what do you think this change of scenery did for her? You know, going from the somewhat sheltered world of Ashfield to the bustling city of Pau.
That's a great question. It definitely exposed her to different cultures and experiences. But in terms of learning French, which was her mother's intention, it sounds like things didn't quite go according to plan.
Right. Most of those lessons with Mademoiselle Markham seem to consist of long, boring walks with the same French phrases repeated over and over again. And whenever they actually needed to communicate something important, they'd revert back to English.
It's a classic language learning experience, isn't it?
Absolutely. But there were some highlights, too, like Agatha's memories of the hotel staff, especially Victor, the waiter.
Ah, yes, Victor. He sounds like a real character.
He does. Even with his strong aroma of garlic, Agatha remembered him fondly. He was so kind to them.
Remember those radish mice he used to make?
Oh, yeah. So sweet. And then came another one of Agatha's mother's sudden certainties. They needed a Swiss girl.
I know, it was so out of the blue. It's quite funny how her mother was so decisive. But you know what? It turned out to be a great decision.
It did. They brought in Marie, and even though there was a bit of awkwardness at first with the language barrier.
Agatha even said they were like two dogs who had just met.
So true.
Yeah.
But they quickly warmed up to each other and became the best of friends.
Sharing all sorts of adventures, getting into mischief together.
And Marie was incredibly loyal. She never once ratted Agatha out, even when she probably should have.
But there was that one little incident with the French phrase about railways, remember? Agatha accidentally said something that deeply upset Marie.
Ah, yes. Just goes to show how sensitive language can be, especially for kids who are still learning.
It's a good reminder for all of us, really. And speaking of different worlds, we have to talk about Agatha's imaginary girls.
Ah, yes. Ethel, Annie, Isabella Sullivan, and Elsie Green. each with their own distinct personality.
And their own imaginary wardrobes. It's amazing how these imaginary companions grew and evolved alongside Agatha.
They even attended operas and had entire wardrobes in Agatha's mind. It's like she was constantly creating and nurturing this rich inner world.
It makes you wonder how much those early imaginative exercises influenced her ability to create such believable and complex characters later on in her writing.
It's a fascinating connection for sure.
But it wasn't all sunshine and roses during Agatha's childhood. She also talks about her father's declining health.
That must have been a very difficult time for the family.
It was. Her father tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but there was this underlying sense of apprehension in the house.
And her brother, Monty, was largely absent from these memories.
Yeah, we get a sense that he was having his own struggles at the time. He wasn't exactly a star student. He even got expelled from Harrow.
Oh, wow.
And then there were his attempts at engineering, which didn't exactly pan out.
I can only imagine how worried their father must have been.
Oh, absolutely. And during this time, Marie, the Swiss girl, left to go back home.
Oh, that's sad.
She missed her family terribly, and she was planning to get married.
Oh, that's actually quite sweet.
It is. But it must have been hard for Agatha to lose her close friend. And then, not long after that, the biggest change of all occurred. Her father's death.
A turning point in her life, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Everything shifted after that. Their social life shrank. They had to tighten their belts financially. It was a real wake-up call.
It makes you think about how much those experiences might have shaped her perspective and the themes she explored in her writing later on.
Totally. I mean, those financial constraints must have exposed her to a whole different reality, to a sense of precarity that she might not have encountered otherwise.
And the shrinking social circle could have forced her to turn inward, to rely more on her own thoughts and imagination.
It's really interesting to think about how much our external circumstances can influence our internal worlds.
For sure. And then there's that poignant scene where Agatha's mother has to let go of some of the staff, including Jane, the cook. She tries to explain the situation to Jane, acknowledging her worth, but emphasizing that they simply can't afford to keep her on.
That's a heartbreaker. It really underscores how their lives had changed.
Yeah, no more Olympian calm in the kitchen after that.
And amidst all this change, there's a surprise. Agatha's mother announces that she's expecting another baby.
Oh, wow. A new sibling. How did Agatha take that?
Well, at first, she didn't quite grasp what was happening.
She was only a kid.
Exactly.
Mm.
And she had this amusing theory about where babies came from.
Oh, do tell.
She thought they came from the navel.
Oh, my goodness. That's precious.
It is. It just shows how innocent and imaginative she was.
And then she became an aunt.
Yes. She was over the moon about becoming a godmother, even if it was by proxy, to her nephew, Jack. She couldn't wait to play with him, even though he mostly just slept.
I think that's a universal experience for new aunts and uncles.
Totally. So much excitement, and then...
A whole lot of sleeping.
Exactly.
Now, around this time, we start to see those first steps into the world of writing.
She started with storytelling.
Remember that pantomime she saw in Denard? It totally sparked something in her.
Oh, yes. And those nightly performances with Marie, I can just imagine how much fun they had.
And then she tries her hand at a full-blown novel.
Snow Upon the Desert. It was her first attempt.
And her mom suggests she seek guidance from Eden Philpotts. Oh, Eden Philpotts. What a character.
I know.
Her description of him is hilarious. He was like a faun.
Right. Not exactly who you'd picture mentoring a future queen of crime.
But he was apparently very encouraging. He liked her manuscript, which must have been a huge confidence boost for her.
Definitely. Imagine getting positive feedback from a successful author. That's gold.
Absolutely. And around this time, she also experiences her first forays into the world of romance.
Oh.
There's this brief engagement to a man named Wilfred, but she quickly realizes it's not the right fit.
And thankfully, it seems to have ended amicably for both of them.
It did. He eventually finds happiness with someone else, and Agatha, well, she moves on to other things, like golf.
Golf? Really?
I know. It seems Reggie, the man she later became engaged to, tried to teach her the game.
And how'd that go?
Not so well. She admits she was absolutely terrible at it. She much preferred croquet, especially with a very generous handicap.
It's so refreshing how candid she is about her. Shall we say, lack of talent.
I know, right? Not everyone can be good at everything. And speaking of Reggie, their engagement was a bit, well, slow for Agatha's liking.
Uh-huh.
It seems she had hoped for something a bit more impulsive, a grand declaration of love, and then...
Straight to the altar.
Exactly. But Reggie was more laid back. Not lacking in feelings for her, mind you, but just not as confident in his own plans.
Interesting.
It was a bit of a contrast to the whirlwind romances you often read about.
It was. But her mother actually approved of the engagement.
She did. She saw Reggie's kindness and gentle nature, even though he wasn't rich. She really believed they would be happy together.
Oh, that's sweet.
It is. And I think it highlights this interesting difference between Agatha's more romantic perspective on love and her mother's more pragmatic one.
Makes sense.
Now, we have to round off this part of our deep dive with the stories of Agatha's maternal grandmother, Grandma B. What an eccentric character.
Oh, Grandma B.
Yay.
Tell me you weren't laughing out loud reading about her.
I was. She was quite the handful. Remember the saga of the handbag she refused to leave in her room?
And that whole incident where she fell out of a bus.
And then stubbornly refused to stow downstairs.
It's hilarious. And then there's the joke about the fat lady stuck in the bus door.
Yeah.
I mean, come on, that's classic.
It is. And, I think these little glimpses into her grandmother's eccentricities are so important because they show how Agatha was already observing those little quirks of human behavior that would later make her characters so memorable.
That's a great point. Inspiration can come from the most unexpected places, even from your own wacky grandmother.
Exactly. And soon after, Agatha's life takes another unexpected turn when she meets Archie Christie.
And enters the exciting world of aviation.
Oh, yes. Archie was completely smitten with the newly formed Royal Flying Corps, and Agatha, well, she was swept up in all the romantic notions of flight.
But Archie had a much more practical view of it all, right?
He did. He saw aviation as a potential mode of transport, especially in times of war. It was the first time Agatha's romanticism really clashed with such a down-to-earth perspective.
It's interesting how their personalities were so different right from the start.
It is, and we also get this fascinating story about Agatha's paternal grandmother and her American investments.
Oh, yes. The Chafflin Company. That was a close call.
It was. She almost lost everything. But thankfully, Mr. Bailey, a trusted friend of the family, stepped in and gave her some very sound advice.
You saved the day.
He did. It's a good reminder that even within families, financial matters can get complicated.
Absolutely. Trust is so important, but so is seeking wise counsel when you need it.
Now, as we approach World War I, Agatha reflects on the general mood at the time. It's interesting because despite the rumors and murmurs of war, she says she didn't really sense that anything big was about to happen.
Yeah, it seems like in 1911, the idea of a global conflict was just too far-fetched.
Like something out of a spy novel, she says.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Nobody could have predicted the scale of what was about to unfold.
And when war did break out, Agatha's life changed dramatically as she joined the ranks of nurses.
What an experience that must have been. I can only imagine the things she must have seen and the people she met.
It was a whole other world. She talks about the strict etiquette in the hospital, especially the rules surrounding interactions with doctors.
Oh, yes. There was a clear hierarchy back then.
There was. Remember that anecdote about the forceps?
Oh, that's a classic. The poor nurse who handed the doctor the wrong instrument and got a stern reprimand for it.
I know. It's funny in hindsight, but it really shows how rigid the structure was.
And amidst the chaos and drama of war, she has this rather trivial argument with Archie about an extravagant dressing case.
Yeah, it's almost comical considering what was going on in the world around them.
It is. But they do eventually reconcile, and Agatha says it actually brought them closer together.
And then there's the story of the sergeant who asks her to write love letters for him to 3 different women.
Oh my goodness, really?
I know. And get this, each letter was supposed to start and end the same way.
That's hilarious, but also a little bit heartbreaking, isn't it?
It is. It's a reminder that even in the midst of war, life and love go on.
And speaking of love and war, while Agatha was working as a nurse, Archie was serving in the war, despite having some health issues.
Right. His sinus problems kept him from flying, but he excelled at administration and organization. He even received a couple of decorations for his service.
Impressive.
He was. But Agatha says his greatest pride was in being mentioned in dispatches by General French.
That's quite an honor.
It is. And it's interesting how those practical achievements meant so much to him.
Yeah, it shows a different side to his personality. Now, it was during this time, during the war, that Agatha started to have those first inklings of what would become her detective fiction.
It's fascinating how those seeds were planted during such a turbulent period.
I know. It's like her mind was finding order and structure amidst the chaos.
Maybe She talks about this initial idea she had for a villain based on a local couple, but she wisely decides against using real people as characters.
Probably a good call.
And then she talks about how she'd watch people in public and imagine their stories. It's amazing how the most mundane encounters can spark such creative ideas.
Absolutely. It's a reminder to pay attention to the world around us. You never know where inspiration might strike.
So true. And she retreats to Dartmoor, to the Moorland Hotel, to actually sit down and write her first book.
I love how she describes her writing process, all those solitary walks and rehearsing dialogue out loud. It sounds so immersive.
It does, and she reflects on how life back then was less luxurious than it would become later on.
Simpler times.
Yeah. Food was simpler, clothes were simpler, people had fewer possessions, but maybe that simplicity allowed for more time for reflection and hobbies.
It's an interesting thought, isn't it? In our world of constant stimulation, it's hard to imagine a life without all the gadgets and distractions.
It is. But maybe we'd be better off for it. And she shares some amusing anecdotes about people she knew from that era, like Belcher, who was in charge of the potato supply during the war.
Oh, Belcher.
He was a character. He even offers to become Archie's financial advisor.
That's hilarious. I wonder how that would have turned out.
I know. Probably not well. And then comes this incredible opportunity, a trip around the world with Archie.
Wow. A dream come true.
It was, but the beginning of the trip was anything but smooth sailing. Remember the voyage on the Kildonan Castle?
Oh, yes. It sounds awful.
It was. Terrible weather, Agatha suffering from terrible seasickness. At one point, a fellow passenger even asked her if she was dead.
Oh, my goodness.
I know.
Yeah.
Thankfully, she made it to Madeira alive and well, and she was able to continue the journey.
What a trooper. I can't even imagine going through something like that.
It does show her incredible resilience, that's for sure. And then her experiences in Australia were completely different. They stayed at this charming officer's residence with black swans on the lake.
So peaceful.
And Agatha was absolutely amazed to discover how pineapples grow. She'd always pictured them hanging from trees. It's so endearing, right? That sense of childlike wonder, even as an adult.
It is. And I love how she describes the vastness of the Australian landscape, that feeling of how easy it would be to get lost.
It's such a contrast to the English countryside she was used to.
For sure.
And then comes the return to England and family life. But things aren't quite as smooth as they hoped.
Oh, what happens?
Well, for starters, Rosalind, their daughter, is initially quite cold towards them.
Oh, that's sad. Maybe she just missed them terribly.
Maybe. And then they have a series of unfortunate nannies.
The nanny struggles continue.
They do. There's Jessie Swannell, who doesn't adapt to the family dynamic at all.
And then they find Cuckoo.
Cuckoo! What a name!
I know.
And she tries all these bizarre ways to bond with Rosalind. It's clear she means well, but she's just so clumsy and incompetent.
Bless her heart. But did Rosalind ever warm up to her?
She did, eventually. And amidst all these family dramas, Agatha's marriage starts to fall apart.
Oh, no. What happened?
Well, Archie becomes increasingly unhappy.
Yeah.
He tells Agatha quite bluntly that he wants her to leave.
Wow, that's harsh.
It was. And it's so sad because she doesn't want to leave. She still wants to support him. But back then, in 1923, it wasn't exactly common for a woman to just pick up and get a job.
No, it wasn't. It was a very different time.
It was. And while all this is happening, little Rosalind creates her own imaginary world with her stuffed bears.
Oh, how sweet.
It is. There's Blue Bear, who's the good one. Then there's Red Bear, who's the naughty one.
Classic.
And then there's Edward Bear, who Agatha describes as nauseating lilac.
Oh my, poor Edward Bear.
I know. And Agatha would make up these stories about their adventures for Rosalind, with Red Bear usually getting into all sorts of mischief.
Those must have been some fun stories.
They were. Rosalind loved them. And then in the midst of all this personal turmoil, there's a glimmer of hope. The Man in the Brand Suit gets published.
That's fantastic.
It is. She receives this unexpected offer from the Evening News for the serial rights. And the story of how they chose the title is pretty amusing.
Tell me more.
So the original title was, well, let's just say it wasn't very catchy.
Okay.
And then they came up with this new title, The Man in the Brown Suit, which is much better.
Yeah, fellas.
But then they suggested another title, Anna the Adventuress, which Agatha thought was even sillier.
Oh my goodness. It does sound a bit over the top.
It does. But in the end, she went with The Man in the Brown Suit, and the book was a success.
That must have been so validating for her.
Oh, absolutely. And that success led to some much-needed financial stability. Archie's career was also looking up, so things were starting to look brighter.
That's great.
It was, and Archie, in a moment of optimism, suggests they buy a car.
Fancy.
Oh.
A sign of the good times rolling in.
Exactly. And then her brother, Monty, returns from Africa with his wife, Shabani.
Oh, how exciting.
It was, but it also brought its share of challenges. Monty's African lifestyle didn't exactly mesh with their mother's more traditional routines.
Oh, dear.
I know, right? It's funny how those little differences can cause friction.
Absolutely. Especially within families.
But Monty had one strong desire. He wanted to live in Dartmoor.
And he did.
He did. Agatha managed to find him this perfect little cottage, and get this, she even found him a housekeeper.
Oh, what was she like?
She was 65 years old, had bleached blonde hair, wore tons of rouge, and had 13 children.
Oh, my goodness. 13 children. That's a house full.
It is. But apparently she was perfect for Monty. And while all this was happening, the man in the brown suit continued to be a success. Agatha even received a new contract offer from Bodley Head.
She'd take it.
She did not. She wasn't afraid to forge her own path. She even tried to publish a non-crime novel, which they rejected.
Interesting. So she was already experimenting with different genres.
She was. And that rejection actually freed her from most of the contract.
Lucky break.
It was. And it seemed like things were finally settling down. Their lives were relatively calm. Archie was happy with his work and his golf, and Agatha's writing was going well. But their social life in Sunningdale wasn't exactly thrilling.
Oh. What was wrong with it?
Well, it was divided between these gardening enthusiasts, which wasn't really their scene, and these wealthy, boisterous types who they didn't really connect with either.
The classic social dilemma.
It was, and Agatha had this rule about not inviting couples to their gatherings.
Interesting. Why was that?
She said she didn't want to feel obligated to reciprocate the invitations.
Makes sense. Socializing can be tricky.
It can be. And then there were the struggles with Rosalind's Swiss governess, Marcel.
What happened there?
Well, Rosalind just didn't get along with her at all. She tormented the poor woman mercilessly.
Oh, dear. Poor Marcel.
Thankfully, she'd eventually agreed to return to Switzerland. Everyone was probably better off for it.
Probably. And then Agatha had to deal with sorting through her paternal grandmother's belongings after she passed away.
That must have been a huge task, both practically and emotionally.
It must have been. And amidst all the old...
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.